Hey guys, tonight we're going to sneak you into a place where life runs on bells, incense, and more than a few strange little jobs that you probably wouldn't put on your modern resume. You're not here as a noble guest or even as a scribe. With delicate fingers, you're here as the person who gets woken before everyone else so you can wake everyone else. You're the monastery's bell ringer, and your shift starts long before the sun even considers showing up. You'll trudge through damp stone corridors, hands freezing, the air heavy with last night's chill. Out in the tower, your job is simple: haul on a rope until a lump of iron big enough to crush you starts swinging like it's got a grudge. The sound will roll across the cloisters, into the surrounding village, and, if the wind's right, out over the fields. Congratulations, you've just jolted awake half the countryside. The bell doesn't care if it's raining, snowing, or if the frost has turned the rope into a stiff, icy snake. Monasteries in medieval Europe ran on a schedule more rigid than any office job. Bells marked matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and complement the holy hours that carved the day into bite-sized prayers. You're not just telling monks when to get up, you're ringing time itself into existence. Historians still argue whether the precision of monastic timekeeping influenced the rise of mechanical clocks, or if it was the other way around. Either way, you're part of that ticking legacy, minus the gears. The bell ropes are thick, scratchy hemp. Pulling them is a full-body workout. You plant your feet, bend your knees, and throw your weight down again and again. There's an art to it. Pull too early and you fight the bell's swing. Too late and you just end up yanking at air. The sound starts as a shudder in the rope, travels up your arms, rattles your teeth, and explodes into the sky. There's a quirky tradition in some abbeys. The bell ringer gets to choose the pattern of ringing for special days. Want to mess with the brothers? Slip in a few unexpected pauses so they think it's a feast day when it's not. Of course, the abbot might not appreciate your creativity, but the real hazard isn't angry monks, it's ladders and heights. Some towers have spiral staircases so narrow you feel your shoulders scrape both sides. Others have ladders that sway with every step. Imagine climbing those in the dark, a stub of tallow candle in one hand, while your other grips a rung that's slick with centuries of use. Miss a step, and it's a long drop to the cold stone below. Then there's the weather. On stormy nights, the tower becomes a wind-howling, rain-soaked echo chamber. Lightning, oh, it loves tall stone structures with metal bells. You might have heard the story of poor brother Edmund in the 14th century, who was literally knocked off his feet when a bolt hit mid-ringing. Whether that tale's true or just monastery gossip, you keep one nervous eye on the sky. Your ears, by the way, are paying the long-term price. The bell is deafening up close, and no one's invented earplugs yet, unless you count shoving bits of wool in your ears, which mostly just makes you itchy. The constant vibrations work into your bones. Years from now, you'll be able to tell the difference between bells by the way they resonate in your ribs. And yes, sometimes you oversleep. When you do, the entire day's rhythm is thrown off. Breakfast's late, prayers are late, and Brother Thomas in the kitchen is glaring at you over the porridge pot. One missed ring and you've single-handedly shifted the monastery's divine schedule. No pressure. But there's a strange piece to the job too. In those few moments before you ring, you're alone in the stillness. The cloister gardens below are just shadows. The world is quiet, and you're the only soul awake except maybe a cat stalking mice in the granary. You can almost hear the centuries breathing around you. And when you haul that rope and the bell's first note blooms in the night air, you're not just marking the hour you're stitching this little patch of the Middle Ages together, one resonant clang at a time. You think the bell ringer job was early. This one might be worse. At least bells don't make you question whether you've just poisoned yourself. As the monastery's herb garden poison tester, your shift starts with, "Do still clinging to leaves in neat little rows." The garden smells of damp earth, rosemary, and if you're unlucky, something faintly like bitter almonds, which, as you've learned, is never a good sign. Your job isn't glamorous. Sure, you tend the medicinal beds, thyme, sage, mint, marigold, and all the more exotic specimens imported by wandering friars who claim to have traveled through Spain, Italy, or even the Holy Land. But tucked among the safe greenery are plants that could heal or kill. Monks in the infirmary rely on your work to make poultices, tinctures, and teas for everything from fevers to festering wounds. And someone has to make sure the foxglove doesn't sneak into the cough. Syrup. Testing doesn't mean you swallow a leaf and hope for the best, at least, not usually. The process is slower, more cautious. You might chew a fragment and spit it out, waiting to see if your tongue tingles or your lips go numb. You might brew a leaf in hot water and taste just a drop. And yes, there's always a nervous moment where you wait to find out if your heart beats, about to become irregular in the fatal sense. Historians still argue whether monasteries deliberately kept dangerous plants in their gardens as a matter of practical medicine, or because they liked having a little botanical mystery under their care. Either way, the line between remedy and poison in the medieval mind was thin. Sometimes the difference was just the amount you used. Your tools are simple: a small pruning knife, a woven basket, and an assortment of clay pots. Each plant is labeled, though the ink often fades and the labels sometimes blow away in the wind. Which is why, last winter, Brother Matthew swore he was giving the abbot a calming chamomile tea, only to realize 2 sips in that it was tansy. The abbot didn't die, but he didn't stop glaring at Matthew for a month. Then there are the rumors. Some brothers whisper that certain plants aren't just for medicine, they're for curses. Mandrake roots shaped like tiny screaming humans, henbane to cloud the mind, monkshood to silence someone permanently. You don't deal in curses, of course, but you've noticed how some jars in the apothecary are kept behind a locked cabinet. The oddest part. There's a certain pride in knowing the plants intimately. You can identify them blindfolded, just by the smell of crushed leaves between your fingers. You know which flowers attract bees and which repel insects. You can predict the weather by how the borage droops in the afternoon heat. And when a travelling merchant brings a strange seed from a far-off port, it's you the abbot calls to plant it. Of course, there are hazards beyond poisoning yourself. The garden attracts more than monks. Cats lounge in the sun, chasing the occasional mouse through your thyme beds. Sometimes you find neat little holes where a hedgehog has been digging for worms. And then there's the goose. No one remembers why the monastery keeps a single, particularly irritable goose. But it has taken a personal dislike to you and will chase you from one end of the garden to the other. Some mornings, while the bells are ringing for prime, you stand, alone in the misty rose, your breath clouding the air, wondering about the long chain of hands that have tended these same plants over centuries. A sprig of rosemary you cut today might be steeped into a tea that saves a life tomorrow, or makes someone regret they ever took a sip. That's the razor's edge you walk every day, and you do it with dirt under your nails, a pocket full of sprigs, and just a hint of suspicion that one day the tester might fail the test. The bell ringer wakes the day, the poison tester keeps it safe, but you keep it writing. You're the monastery's ink maker, and your world is a mixture of soot, bugs, vinegar, and a smell so pungent it could clear the choir stalls. It begins in a cramped little workshop, the kind of place where light filters in through a single high window and dust motes drift lazily in the air. Your workbench is scarred with decades of cuts, burn marks, and mysterious stains. On one shelf sits a jumble of clay jars, each sealed with wax to keep the contents from evaporating. On another, bundles of herbs hang drying, though most of those are for masking the smell rather than for actual use. The main recipe is deceptively simple. You take lampblack, the soot that collects on the inside of oil lamp sand, grind it into a fine powder. You mix it with gum arabic to bind it, and water to thin it. That's your basic black ink. But black isn't always enough. For rich, lasting pigments, you need more exotic sources. Red might come from crushed cochineal insects, imported from far-off lands. Green could be made from verdigris scopa plates, left to corrode in vinegar, scraped down into a vivid powder. And gold, well, that requires actual gold leaf, beaten so thin it flutters with your breath, then ground with honey until it's pentable. Historians still argue whether monasteries guarded their ink recipes like trade secrets or freely shared them with other scriptoria. What's certain is that bad ink could ruin a manuscript. Imagine spending 3 months copying a gospel only to watch the letters fade to a ghostly grey in a few seasons. That's why you test every batch on scraps of vellum before it goes anywhere near a real text. The strangest ingredient in your arsenal might be gall, ink made from oak galls. Those strange little growths you find on leaves. They're full of tannin, and when boiled with iron salts, they produce an inky black so permanent it can outlast the page itself. The downside, it smells like a cross between rusty nails and vinegar gone wrong. Then there's the bug problem. Not pests eating the parchment, though that happens too, but bugs in the ink. In some recipes, crushed wasp nests or certain beetles add color or binding qualities. You've spent many afternoons picking tiny insect legs out of your mixing bowl, muttering under your breath. And yes, you've accidentally swatted a fly into a fresh pot of ink more times than you care to admit. Your job isn't just chemistry. Diplomacy. The scribes in the scriptorium are a demanding lot. Brother Peter wants his ink slightly thicker so it doesn't run on the finer vellum. Brother John insists on a blue so deep it makes the Virgin's robes in his illustrations shine like heaven. You spend half your time adjusting recipes to please them, and the other half telling them why their requests are impossible without bankrupting the monastery. And of course, storage is its own headache. Ink freezes in winter, dries out in summer, and always seems to attract the attention of the novice who thinks it would be funny to dip his finger in and draw a moustache on the abbot's portrait. Still, there's a quiet pride in your work. Every letter copied, every illuminated page, every tiny flourish owes something to your messy little workshop. Without you, the words of saints, scholars, and chroniclers would never make it past a faint scratch on the page. Sometimes, late at night, when everyone else is asleep, you test a new mix. The candlelight flickers over your hands as you stir, the scent of vinegar and soot curling into the air. You take up a quill, dip it in, and write a single word, maybe your own name, just to see how it flows. And for a moment, you feel like you've signed yourself into history. The ink maker's fingers stain the page, but your job stains your soul at least. That's what Brother Thomas says when he catches you sneezing near the saint's femur. You're the monastery's relic dust cleaner, and your task is exactly what it sounds like. Keep centuries-old holy objects, spotless without damaging the fragment of history or miracle that they are. Relics come in all shapes and levels of eyebrow-raising, a bit of bone sealed in a glass tube, a tattered scrap of robe said to have touched the Virgin Mary, a vial of what's claimed to be a martyr's dried blood. Some relics are small enough to fit in your palm. Others are set into massive gilded reliquaries so heavy you need 2 brothers and a prayer to move them. And they all, without exception, collect dust. The trouble is, you can't just blow on them or swipe them with your sleeve. Each one demands its own ritual. A silver reliquary gets wiped with a soft cloth dipped in a mild vinegar solution. Too wet, because moisture invites tarnish. A wooden chest containing a saint's sandal. You gently brush the grain with a feather duster, careful not to dislodge a single splinter. And if the relic itself is exposed, like a jawbone resting on a velvet cushion, you do not, under any circumstances, sneeze. Historians still argue whether medieval monks truly believed every relic was genuine, or whether some knowingly kept, let's say, symbolic items to inspire faith. Whatever the truth, you treat each object with absolute reverence. Even the one labelled tooth of St. Barnabas, that suspiciously resembles a boar's molar. Your cleaning kit is modest. Linen cloths, a squirrel hair brush, a small pot of beeswax polish, and a leather pouch to keep them in. The feather duster, plucked from a goose that honked its way into monastery legend, is your most prized tool. It's light enough to avoid scratching gold leaf, but sturdy enough to sweep away. Stubborn cobwebs dot the job also means working in the reliquary room, space that feels more like a treasury than a chapel. The air smells faintly of incense and old fabric, thick enough that it clings to your robes long after you've left. Light filters through narrow stained glass windows, casting coloured patches over the reliquaries so they glow as if lit from within. Sometimes you swear the dust motes themselves drift slower here, reluctant to settle on holy ground. There's superstition in the air too. Some brothers refuse to enter the room alone, claiming to have heard faint whispers near the display of St. Ethelred's finger bones. Others insist that relics must never be cleaned after sunset, lest you disturb the spirits of the saints. You're not sure you believe that though you admit you do the job faster on dark, stormy evenings. Every now and then, the monastery displays its most treasured relics during a festival or holy day. That means extra work for you, polishing the cases, replacing the faded velvet lining, and making sure the gold inlay gleams just right for the pilgrims who will travel days to glimpse it. It's not vanity, it's devotion through maintenance. If the relic looks neglected, people might doubt its sanctity, and yet there's an odd intimacy to your work. You handle these objects more often than anyone else in the monastery. You notice the hairline crack in the reliquary's crystal before anyone else. You see the way the silver dulls when the weather turns damp. You know the exact moment when incense smoke leaves a faint golden haze on the glass. Sometimes, when you're alone, you catch yourself wondering about the lives these bones and scraps once belonged to. Did the saint whose rib you polish ever imagine that centuries later, someone would fuss over it like a priceless jewel? And what would they think of you hunched over with your goose feather, muttering at a stubborn patch of dust like it's defying the divine order? Still, you keep at it, because in a monastery, holiness isn't just in the prayers, it's in the care taken to make even the smallest fragment of faith shine. The reliquary room smells of incense and polish, but out here by the fish ponds, the air smells like, well, fish. You're the monastery's fish pond wrangler, and your life is one long battle to keep slippery, scaly creatures alive, fat, and ready for the abbot's table, especially during Lent. When meat is off the menu and the ponds become the most important pantry in the cloister, your shift begins before dawn, the mist still lying low over the water. The ponds aren't picturesque ornamental things, they're working ponds, dug deep and wide, lined with muddy banks, and usually teeming with carp, tench, and pike. In some monasteries, there are elaborate systems of sluices and channels, so you can drain a pond for cleaning or funnel fish into a holding area. In yours, the system is, let's say, more rustic. If you want to corral the fish, you wade in with a net and hope you don't end up flat on your back in the muck. Rules are strict. You must feed them regularly grain mash in the summer, sometimes dried peas or leftover bread, and check for signs of disease. A pale patch on a carp's scales can spell disaster for the whole pond. And because fish don't meow or bleat to tell you they're hungry, you have to know by instinct. Historians still argue whether medieval monks kept fish purely for diet or also for trade. Records show some abbeys sold surplus fish to local markets, which means your work could directly bring in silver for the monastery. That's a lot of pressure for someone ankle-deep in mud with a splintered net pole. The pond has its own caste of troublemakers. There's the heron who treats your hard work like a buffet, standing perfectly still until Esnapit grabs a fish in its beak. There's the occasional otter, sleek and smug, leaving only half-eaten carcasses as evidence of its midnight raids. And then there are the geese always, the geese who waddle down to the bank, drink your pond water, and look personally offended when you chase them off. Your work isn't just feeding and guarding. You also maintain the banks, patching weak spots where water seeps out, clearing weeds that choke the edges, and making sure the sluice gates don't jam with silt. The ponds freeze in winter, and it's your job to break the ice so the fish can breathe and exercise in both muscle and misery when the wind is cutting straight through your robes. There's one part of the year that turns your job into a spectacle, the annual pond draining. The whole community gathers to watch as the water is let out. The fish thrash in the shallows, and monks wade in to scoop them up in baskets. It's wet, cold, chaotic, and hilarious. And hilarious unless you're the one who slips in the mud and loses your footing in front of the abbot, which you will eventually. Everyone does. The quirkiest task, transporting live fish for a feast. That means hauling them in barrels sloshing with water, sometimes miles along muddy tracks to another monastery or a noble's hall. You've learned the hard way that carp are escape artists. Leave the lid off for a moment and they'll fling themselves into the nearest ditch. Still, there's a quiet reward in it. On calm mornings, you watch the surface of the pond ripple. As the fish rise for their breakfast, the water catching the pale gold of early sunlight. You know exactly how many lurk in the deeper channels, which ones are ready for harvest, and which are the sly old survivors from seasons past. And when the abbot tucks into a steaming platter of carp, you can almost hear him thinking, "Ah, well fed, well raised." He'll never say it aloud, of course, but you'll know, out by the ponds, your work was messy and wet. In here, your work is delicate, so delicate that a single misplaced breath could ruin hours of effort. You're the illumination gold leaf applier, the one who gives medieval manuscripts their holy shimmer. Without you, saints would stand halorless, and gospel capitals would sit naked in their margins. The scriptorium smells faintly of ink, vellum, and the beeswax that seals the windows against drafts. You take your place at a long bench, next to the scribes who scratch their letters into parchment. Their job is words. Yours is light. Your tools, a burnisher carved from agate, a small knife for trimming gold, a palette for mixing gesso, and a brush so fine it makes a cat's whisker look like a broom. Gold leaf is fickle, stuff thinner than a breath, lighter than dust. It clings to your fingers, your sleeves, even your eyebrows if you're careless. You keep it between sheets of parchment, sliding one out at a time with the same care you'd give a spiderweb. When you exhale, you turn your head away so you don't send the entire sheet fluttering across the room. The process starts with preparation. You paint the area where the gold will go with gesso, mix of gypsum, glue, and a touch of red ochre so you can see it. Once it's tacky, you lay down the leaf, pressing it gently with your brush. Then you burnish it, coaxing out a shine so bright it seems to hum in the candlelight. On a good day, the gold looks as though it's floating above the page. Historians still argue whether the use of gold leaf in manuscripts was purely decorative or meant as a literal reflection of divine light. Either way, you've watched monks pause mid-reading, mesmerized by a gilded letter be at the start of a psalm. That pause is your signature. There are hazards, of course. Drafts are your enemy, one careless gust from an open door, and your gold leaf drifts away like a mischievous spirit. Sticky fingers are just as bad. Once, Brother Michael leaned over to admire your work and left a perfect thumbprint in the middle of St. Luke's halo. He still insists it was an unintentional relic. Then there's the cost. Gold leaf isn't cheap, and the abbot keeps a close eye on your supply. You measure out each sheet as if you were handling the monastery's last coin. Drop one into a crack in the floorboards, and you'll be fishing it out with a needle for the rest of the afternoon. But there are moments when the work feels like magic. You press the gold, smooth it, and see your own reflection in the tiny arc of a letter. The light shifts, and suddenly the page is alive. In the dim, echoing halls of the monastery, where days blend into seasons, those tiny flashes of brightness are like frozen sunlight. The work demands stillness, not just in your hands, but in your mind. Outside, bells ring, carts rumble over cobblestones, brothers call to each other in the cloisters. You block it all out, focusing on the exact curve of a gilded wing, the glint on a crown, the narrow thread of gold outlining a saint's robe. Sometimes you think about the future. This page you're working on might outlive you by centuries, carried across kingdoms, displayed in a cathedral, or locked in a collector's cabinet. Long after your name is forgotten, someone will tilt it toward the light and see the same gleam you see now. You set down your burnisher, flex your cramped fingers, and brush away the stray flakes clinging to your robe. Somewhere outside, the fish pond wrangler is probably chasing a goose. In here, in this quiet pool of golden light, you've made the Middle Ages glow just a little brighter. The gold leaf applier works in a world of delicate shine, but your work is in the dark, cool, slightly damp underbelly of the monastery. You're the wine cellar guardian, and your life is a mix of constant vigilance, the faint smell of fermenting grapes, and the knowledge that half your fellow monks would cheerfully help with quality control if you let them. The cellar is carved deep into the earth, stone walls sweating with cool moisture that keeps the barrels just right. It's dim down here, the air heavy and still, broken only by the occasional creak of wood as the casks settle. Rows of oak barrels line the space, each one bound in iron hoops. their sides stained with the faint reddish-brown halo of years of wine. The floor is gravel, easy to sweep, and it crunches softly under your sandals. Your main duty is to keep the wine safe from spoilage, pests, and temptation. Mice are relentless, gnawing through staves if they smell even a hint of sweetness. Mold creeps in if you don't keep the airflow just right. And then there's Brother Matthew, who just happened to wander into the cellar 3 times last week for prayerful contemplation. Historians still argue whether monastic winemaking was primarily for sacramental use or for trade. The truth is, it's both. Yes, wine is needed for the Mass, but monasteries also sold surplus to nearby villagers or traveling merchants. A well-aged barrel could bring in a tidy profit if it survived long enough without leaking or mysteriously evaporating. You keep meticulous records, which barrels were tapped when, how much was drawn off, and which vintages are best suited for immediate use versus long-term storage. A single bad cask can taint an entire batch, so you check them daily, tapping gently with a mallet to listen for the dull thud that means swelling wood or the faint hiss of escaping air. There are little tricks you've learned over the years. Keep herbs like rosemary and lavender hanging from the beams to deter insects. Stack the barrels so that the older ones are always within easy reach. Less temptation for a bored novice to tamper with the good stuff. And always taste test from the tap before a feast. Because there's nothing more embarrassing than pouring sour wine for the abbot's honored guest. The job isn't all isolation. Sometimes you're called to bring up a cask for a festival, rolling it carefully along wooden planks so it doesn't split open on the way. On those days, you hear laughter from the courtyard, smell the roasting meat from the kitchens, and think maybe this job isn't so lonely after all. Still, most of your work happens in the kind of silence you can feel. You know every creak of the beams overhead, every damp patch along the wall, every spiderweb in the corners. You've shared this space with the same barrels for months, sometimes years, and when one is finally emptied and hauled away, it feels like losing an old friend. The oddest hazard. Candlelight. You work by a small shielded flame, and the thought of dropping it near all this oak and straw is enough to make your stomach twist. So you move slowly, deliberately, never letting your robe brush the flame. Sometimes, when the day is done and you're locking up, you catch yourself lingering. The air is cool against your face, the smell of oak and wine rich and comforting. You imagine the grapes hanging heavy in the sunlit vineyards months ago, their juice now resting quietly in the casks around you. And you think, I'm the keeper of this waiting. And yes, occasionally, on a particularly cold evening, you might pour yourself the tiniest sip purely for quality assurance, of course. After all, even the most vigilant guardian has to make sure his charges are aging well. You wouldn't think candle wax could run an entire monastery economy, but it does. Every evening, when the last chant fades and the chapel is lit only by the sigh of the wind, you begin your work. You carry a small wooden box, a dull-bladed knife, and the patience of a saint. Your task is to scrape, yes, scrape the hardened drips of wax from every surface in the building, from the long brass candlesticks beside the altar to the tiny votive cups in the side chapels. Every crumb of wax is precious. You kneel beneath the pews, prying up lumps from the floor where it has cooled into pale little puddles. You pick at the carved wooden choir stalls, teasing wax out of the grooves as though it were gold dust in a mine. The smell follows you everywhere. Warm tallow, faintly sweet beeswax, and that faint temps of smoke. Sometimes the wax comes away in neat curls, satisfying as peeling bark from a birch tree. Sometimes it's fused stubbornly to the wood, forcing you to scrape slowly, flake by flake, while your knees go numb on the stone floor. When your box is full, you take it to the workshop, where the wax is melted down and poured into fresh molds. Some candles will end up back in the chapel. Others might be sold to merchants or gifted to noble patrons. You think of it as a kind of resurrection, old light reborn, drop by drop. It's quiet work. You hear the creak of the building settling, the distant splash of water in the cloister fountain, the occasional mouse scurrying away. No one thanks you for it, but without you, the monastery would burn through its candlestock in half the time. And good light in this place is as vital as bread by day. The monastery's herb garden is a gentle place. Rows of sage, mint, rosemary, and medicinal plants, each bed edged with neat stones. But your work begins when the sun sinks and the shadows stretch long. You're not here to tend the plants. You're here to defend them. Rabbits, deer, and the occasional very determined goose see the garden as a free buffet. And in the stillness of night, their chewing can sound like thunder. You make slow patrols along the garden wall, a small lantern in hand, the light catching the pale fuzz on the leaves. The air is thick with scent, lavender sighing in the cool breeze, thyme releasing its sharp perfume under your boots. Somewhere near the parsley patch, a frog croaks lazily as if mocking your vigilance. You listen hard for the faint rustle of an intruder. When you hear it, you move quickly, clapping your hands or tossing a pebble to send the culprit fleeing into the dark. Sometimes the danger isn't from animals at all. A hungry villager might try to scale the wall for a handful of onions or a pouch of healing comfrey. You don't shout at them, you simply stand there, silent and still, until they realize they've been seen. More than once, you've watched them melt back into the night without a word. It's a lonely job, but there's a strange peace to it. The stars wheel slowly overhead, the monastery bells mark the hours, and the fragrance of the plants clings to your clothes. By dawn, the herbs are safe for another day, and you hand over the watch to the gardeners, slipping quietly to your own bed as the first prayers begin. The garden's night watch fades with dawn, but the bakery hums to life just as you're shaking off sleep. You're the bread of a night watcher, stationed beside the roaring hearth while the rest of the monastery dreams. Your job is deceptively simple. Make sure tomorrow's bread isn't burned, stolen, or ruined before it even leaves. The oven, the smell is intoxicating, yeasty, dough warming, smoke curling from the chimney, and the faint tang of flour dusting the air. You poke at logs, coax flames, and adjust oven doors with the careful precision of someone diffusing a bomb made of crust. One too hot corner, and a batch of loaves goes black. One too cool oven, and the dough refuses to rise. Your work is rhythm, intuition, and a bit of luck. Historians still argue whether monasteries perfected bread-making out of necessity or divine obsession. Records show that some abbeys had multiple bakers and ovens running simultaneously, churning out hundreds of loaves a day. And that's where you come in, the night shift. You ensure continuity, because no one wants cold, undercooked bread at prime. You're also the deterrent. A novice with a sweet tooth might wander in for a midnight taste, or a hungry rat might decide your carefully stacked loaves are a buffet. You shoo both away, muttering prayers and threats under your breath, leaning on the wooden paddle like a shield. The occasional spill of flour makes your hands white as snow and your nose itchy, but you endure. The weirdest part, timing, bread. Dough is alive, it breathes, it rests, it panics if disturbed. You must tap the loaves just so, listening for that hollow sound that tells you they're fully baked. One wrong tap, and you've either undercooked or overbaked, and the abbot's breakfast is ruined. Sometimes, when everything is perfect, you step back and admire the oven's glow on the neatly lined loaves, each one golden and puffed just right. There's a quiet triumph in knowing that tomorrow, when the brothers gather for matins, their first taste of the day will be your handiwork. Even in exhaustion, you can't help a small smile. In this job, like so many in the monastery, patience, vigilance, and a touch of stubbornness turn ordinary work into a kind of art. From the warmth of the bakery, you stumble into the scriptorium, parchment under your arm, ink-stained fingers twitching. You're the scriptorium eraser, the one who rescues sacred texts from the fatal slip of a quill. Every misplaced stroke, every crooked letter, every flubbed Latin phrase passes through your hands before it reaches the eyes of the devout. Your tool is deceptively simple, a small knife, thin and sharp, known as a penknife. You scrape, carefully shaving off the top layer of vellum without puncturing it. It's painstaking, nerve-wracking work. One slip, and the monk who labored for weeks on a gospel page might have to start over entirely. The slightest miscalculation leaves a patch so visible it shines under candlelight, like a white scar across sacred words. Historians still argue whether the practice of scraping mistakes influenced early paper-making techniques, or whether it merely reflects the monkish obsession with perfection. Either way, it's your little secret. You wield life or death power over letters, silently shaping the legacy of centuries. Sometimes the mistakes are laughable, a misspelled saint's name, a looped letter in the wrong place. Other times, they're catastrophic, a miswritten numeral that could confuse generations of clergy reading tithes or liturgical schedules. You correct each one with solemn precision, almost performing a ritual in itself. The quill never sees the correction, only the patient knife and your steady hands. The work requires focus. Hours slip by unnoticed, the scratching of your knife echoing softly against stone walls. Candle flames flicker, dust motes drift, and you feel the weight of centuries pressing lightly on your shoulders. There's pride in it, quiet satisfaction, in turning a mistake into perfection without anyone ever knowing you were there. And then there's the smell, vellum, ink, and the faint tang of gum arabic mingling in your nostrils as you scrape away mistakes. Every page is a puzzle, every letter a challenge, and every flawless manuscript a tiny triumph of patience. Some days, you pause to imagine how these corrected pages will survive long after your hands are gone, tucked in libraries or carried by pilgrims, the words intact because you insisted on perfection. It's meticulous, exhausting, occasionally frustrating, but utterly indispensable. If you thought scrapers in the scriptorium had it bad, try being the monastery's latrine keeper, job as malodorous as it sounds. You trudge through the stone corridors to the outhouse pits, tools in hand, ready to tend the, well, let's call it the human byproduct department. The latrines are long trenches, lined with rough-hewn stone, where the monks relieve themselves in shifts. Your task is simple in theory. Keep the pits functional, clean, and free from overflow. In practice, it's a combination of baling, scraping, and very careful shoveling. The smell is a mix of ammonia, damp stone, and centuries of neglect, occasionally punctuated by the faint tints of herbs thrown in to mask it. Historians still argue whether monastic latrine placement reflected hygiene or simply convenience. Either way, your work is central to everyone's health. If a pit backs up or becomes stagnant, the whole community suffers. And a single misstep could mean illness spreading faster than gossip in the cloisters. You're armed with a wooden shovel, a bucket, and sometimes a long stick to poke and stir. Herbs like mint or rosemary are strewn across the floors to reduce odor and encourage pleasant bacteria to keep things moving. You navigate the trench carefully. One slip could have you submerged in something foul enough to haunt your dreams. The role is strangely social in an indirect way. Monks, walking by, often offer advice or grumble about the state of affairs. A little more rosemary here, or the trench wall is leaning again, never realizing that their words guide your labor. You also keep records of cleaning, pit depth, and repairs, because even latrines have schedules, and missing one could be catastrophic. Yet there's a rhythm to it. The scraping, the bailing, the careful placement of herbsol, of it becomes a sort of meditation. You notice the sound of water running through the drainage channels, the flicker of light off damp stone, the way the morning sun hits the moss along the wall. You might even chuckle sometimes at the absurdity. A room full of learned monks, praying, copying manuscripts, debating theology, all relying on you to make sure they have somewhere to do their business. Without you, their holiness might be tested more than they'd like. By the end of your shift, exhausted and smelling faintly of tallow and herbs, there's a quiet satisfaction in knowing that life continues smoothly above, thanks to the invisible, smelly work you've done below. From the depths of the latrines, you move to a slightly less pungent realm, the monastery's bell inspector. At first glance, it sounds poetic listening to peals of bronze echo across the valley. In reality, it's a climb, a haul, and sometimes a near miss with death. The bells are massive, their bronze bodies hung from thick timbers high in the bell tower. Your job is to ensure that each bell rings true, that the clappers are aligned, the supports solid, and the ropes free of frays. A cracked bell can throw off the rhythm of daily prayers, confuse the monks, and, if ignored long enough, collapse the entire bell structure. And yes, a dropped clapper is heavy enough to break bones or worse. Historians still argue whether bell ringing was purely functional, meant to mark canonical hours, or partly ritualistic, believed to keep evil spirits at bay. Either way, your work is crucial. Without you, the monastery would be silent or, worse, cacophonous. The climb is a feat in itself. You ascend narrow wooden staircases, winding higher and higher, the walls echoing every step. Sometimes you must shimmy along beams, balance on thin ledges, and crane your neck to examine the mounting. The wind howls through the openings, tugging at your robes, reminding you that a single slip could be catastrophic. Then comes the tuning. Bells must produce a rich, sonorous note. To dull, and the abbot complains. To shrill, and the villagers won't be able to hear them from the fields. You tap lightly, listen carefully, adjust clappers or supporting beams. Occasionally, a bell must be struck by hand to test its toner bone-jarring experience that leaves you temporarily deaf if done too close. And, of course, there's rope management. Frayed or twisted ropes can snap at the worst moment, sending a bell crashing into the tower floor or leaving a novice dangling mid-air. You inspect each cord meticulously, weaving, knotting, and occasionally replacing it entirely. Despite the hazards, there's majesty in your job when all the bells toll. In perfect harmony, the valley vibrates with their resonance. Birds scatter, wind carries the sound to neighboring villages, and you feel an odd pride. Your work literally sets the rhythm of monastic life. By the time you descend, knees shaking and muscles aching, the monastery feels alive in a way it never does at ground level. You've touched bronze, timber, and wind. You've calibrated heaven's soundtrack, and for a moment, everything is perfect. From the lofty echoes of the bell tower, you descend into a different kind of precision work, one that smells less of dust and rope fibers, and more of beeswax, ink, and vellum. You've been assigned to the scriptorium as a pigment grinder, an illuminator's assistant. The scriptorium is the monastery's beating intellectual heart. Long wooden tables, quills scratching in steady rhythm, the faint hiss of candle flames. In one corner, a monk meticulously copies the Psalms. In another, an illuminator bends over a page, painting gold leaf onto the halo of a saint. And in the back, near the open shutters for ventilation, is your station, the pigment bench. Your job begins with raw materials, most of them deceptively beautiful. Lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, malachite from the mountains, cinnabar, bright as spilled blood. Each must be ground into the finest possible powder, then mixed with egg yolk, gum, Arabic, or glare-whipped egg white to make paint. The grinding is slow and meditative, but also dangerous. Too much cinnabar dust in your lungs, and you'll cough crimson for days. Mercury poisoning doesn't announce itself kindly. Once the pigments are ready, you bring them to the illuminator. They trust you to deliver the right hues in perfect consistency. A page ruined by a blotchy blue or streaky gold is an expensive mistake. The gold leaf itself is a marvel, impossibly thin sheets that float if you breathe too hard. You learn to hold your breath while placing them, pressing them down gently with a squirrel hair brush until the surface gleams like a miniature sun. But it's not all artistry. You also make the inks black from oak galls soaked in vinegar, green from verdigris scraped off copper, red from madder root. The smells mingle into something oddly pleasant, like a mix of earth, metal, and forest floor. The monks joke that you'll never be able to smell plain air again without thinking of parchment. Illuminators are perfectionists. They will send you back to regrint a pigment if it's a shade off. They will ask for gold leaf, so smooth it could blind an ant. But when the page is complete, a vivid Christ in robes of lapis, a curling vine of emeralds, a border lined in fire-bright red dew, understand the obsession. You're not just decorating books. You're crafting objects that will outlast kings. By sunset, your hands are stained in colors you can't name. Your fingernails are edged in ultramarine dust. Your sleeves are freckled with tiny gold flecks. You sweep the pigment bench clean, cover the mortar and pestles, and close the shutters to keep the evening damp from curling the pages. And as you leave, you glance at the nearly finished manuscript, to gospel, so richly colored it could make even the most illiterate peasant believe heaven was only a page away. Night cloaks the monastery in a velvet hush, but your day is far from over. After the scriptorium, you're sent to join the other lay brothers in the refectory, not for a feast, but for the quiet, ritual meal that ends the working hours. The refectory is long and narrow, lit by tallow lamps that flicker in the draughts. A monk stands at a lectern near the center, reading from a Latin text in a steady, sing-song voice. The rest of you eat in silence, listening to scripture or the life of some saint who lived, suffered, and died centuries ago. The food is humble: pottage, coarse rye bread, Maybe a wedge of cheese if the kitchen's been generous. You drink weak ale because water is considered far less safe. The taste is yeasty and thin, but it's warm in the belly. After the meal, the cleanup is brisk and practiced. Bowls are stacked, tables wiped, floors swept. The monks disperse, some to prayer, others to tend to small evening tasks. You're sent to the cloister walk for Compline, the last service of the day. The air is cold and damp here, carrying the scent of moss and the faint, acrid whiff of spent lamp oil. Candles in iron sconces throw halos of gold against the stone. The chanting begins low, almost like the wind moaning through the trees, then swells into harmony. Latin syllables roll over the arches and seem to linger in the rafters long after the final Amen. You don't understand every word, but you feel the weight of centuries in the voices, the same prayers, sung the same way in this place for generations. When Compline ends, you're guided to the dormitory, a long hall with rows of narrow pallets stuffed with straw. Blankets are thin, the kind that let the cold in like a slow leak, and the smell is a blend of wool, old sweat, and damp stone. There is no idle chatter. Rule forbids speaking after the final prayers. The only sounds are the rustle of rough bedding, the sigh of someone settling in, the occasional cough. You lie down, staring at the dark beams above. Your hands still smell faintly of lapis and oak gall ink. Your muscles hum with the memory of hauling stones, grinding pigments, and sweeping floors. And your mind drifts not to the endless work ahead, but to the strange, stubborn beauty of this place. Here, time doesn't rush. It moves like the slow swing of the bell in the tower, steady and inevitable. The same prayers, the same meals, the same labors repeat day after day, season after season. It is a life bound by rules and rhythm, but also one where the smallest things a gold leaf halo, the taste of new bread, a shaft of morning light through a high window can feel like miracles. As sleep closes in, you think about the bell that will wake you again before dawn, the frost on the cloister stones, the first notes of matins, and you realize this isn't just a day in a medieval monastery. It's the beginning of an unending circle, one you've stepped into and will walk until your last breath, until history itself moves on without you. And so, the final bell fades into the night, its echo drifting over rooftops and vanishing into the still air. You've walked the crooked lanes, past shuttered windows, and felt the hush that comes when a city finally exhales. The plague doctor's lantern has gone out. The masks are set aside. For a moment, there is only the quiet, deep and unbroken, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Rest now. Let the flicker of candlelight fade from your mind. Let the smell of herbs and smoke drift away. Sleep will come like the slow tide, washing the day from your skin. And somewhere in that gentle dark, the past will wait ready to whisper its next secret when you return.